When someone mentions South Korea, I bet most people think of like K-pop, right?
Oh, totally.
And all the crazy technology coming out of there.
Yeah. Like Samsung and all that.
Yeah, it seems like such a modern place.
Yeah, like a real cultural force, you know?
For sure. But today we're going to peel back some of those layers and really look at some of the more difficult stuff happening there.
Yeah, the stuff you don't always hear about. We've got a really interesting mix of sources for this one. Some news analysis, documentaries, even personal stories. We really want to get a good grasp of what's going on beneath the surface.
Awesome. Well, let's get started with something that really grabbed everyone's attention. President Yoon's super brief declaration of martial law. It honestly felt a bit surreal.
It was quite a shock. To understand it, though, it's really important to remember the political situation there. President Yoon is leading a minority government, and the National Assembly is controlled by the opposition, the Democratic Party. So his reason for declaring martial law was supposedly to guard against North Korean communist forces and to protect the constitutional order. But here's the thing. No real evidence was given to back those claims up.
And I remember the reaction was pretty intense. Lawmakers barricading themselves, people protesting in the streets. It seemed like the whole country was thrown for a loop.
Oh, absolutely. People from all sides, politicians and the public, were shocked and condemned the declaration. You're right. Lawmakers actually barricaded themselves in the National Assembly building, and thousands of people took to the streets. It created such a huge backlash that President Yoon ended up reversing the declaration just 6 hours later.
6 hours. Wow.
It's crazy. And think about this. It was the first time in over 40 years that martial law had even been declared in South Korea.
That really puts things in perspective. So what happened after that? I know there were calls for President Yoon to resign and even some talk of impeaching him.
There definitely was a lot of pressure for him to step down. Impeachment became a real possibility, too. It was a big deal. Something like 190 lawmakers from different opposition parties came out and said they wanted to impeach him. What's interesting, though, is that it wouldn't actually take that many defections from his own party to start the impeachment process in the National Assembly.
Really?
Yeah, just about 9 members switching sides would be enough.
Okay, so let's say the impeachment process does start. What does that look like? Would it be resolved quickly?
No, not at all. It would be a long process.
Hmm.
If the impeachment is successful in the National Assembly, then it goes to the Constitutional Court for a trial. That could drag on for months. If President Yoon is removed from office, it would probably trigger a new election, which would be a huge shakeup in the political landscape, both within South Korea and for other countries.
You mentioned it would have implications for other countries. I'm curious how a change in South Korean leadership would affect the region and the world.
So President Yoon has been all about improving relations with Japan and strengthening ties with the U.S. He's also taken a pretty strong stance against North Korea and even provided some military aid to Ukraine. Now, the Democratic Party, they have different views. They're more skeptical of Japan because of their history. They prefer talking and engaging with North Korea, and they don't support direct military assistance to Ukraine. So you can see how a leadership change could really shift South Korea's whole approach to these big global issues.
It's wild to think about how interconnected everything is. So zooming back in on South Korea, it seems like this whole situation reveals some pretty deep cracks in their political system.
It really does. It highlights how divided things have become. It's gotten really polarized there. And then you add in this trend of more and more political figures being prosecuted, which just makes people distrust the system even more. It's a recipe for instability. It makes you wonder if this is a turning point that could lead to some positive changes, or if it will just make things even worse.
That's a great question. It definitely makes you think about what's next for South Korea.
Okay.
So let's move on to the social and economic side of things. I was struck by the idea of a dark side beneath the glittering facade of Seoul. What are some of the most shocking examples of this inequality?
It's crazy, right? You see pictures of Seoul and it looks so wealthy and futuristic, but then you dig a little deeper and you find all this inequality and poverty hidden underneath, like the banjiha, those semi-basement apartments. They've become a symbol of that gap between rich and poor.
Yeah, I've heard about those. They don't sound like great places to live.
They're not ideal, that's for sure. For a lot of people, they're the only option they can afford. But then you have those awful floods in 2022, and it was just devastating. A bunch of people living in those banjiha died. It really exposed how vulnerable they are, how easily things can go wrong.
That was such a horrible tragedy. It made me think about how easy it is to ignore those less visible communities
Yeah.
when you're focused on the skyscrapers and all the modern stuff.
Totally. And it's not just the Banjiha. There's this place called Guryong Village right in the middle of Gangnam, one of the richest areas in Seoul.
Really?
Yeah, it's basically a slum that's been there since the Korean War. These people were displaced by the war and they built these makeshift homes. And for decades, they've been living in these terrible conditions, constantly threatened with being evicted because of all the development going on around them. There have been these awful fires, too, in 2014 and then again in 2023. And every time, they're promised they'll be relocated, but nothing really happens. It's like they're just forgotten about, living in the shadow of all this wealth.
It's almost like they're an embarrassment, like they don't fit in with the image that Seoul wants to project to the world.
That's a good way to put it. And it's not just about housing either. Young people in South Korea, they face so much pressure. It's super competitive, whether it's getting into university or finding a decent job. They work these insane hours, but their wages haven't kept up with the rising cost of living. It's no wonder they're hesitant to start families. There's this saying they use dirt spoons.
Dirt spoons. What does that mean?
It's a way of talking about how your chances in life are limited by the family you're born into. So if you're born rich, you have a golden spoon, meaning you've got it easy. But if you're born poor, you get a dirt spoon, meaning you're always going to struggle no matter how hard you work. It's a pretty depressing way to look at things.
Yeah, it's really bleak. It sounds like gender inequality is another big problem in South Korea, like it's really baked into the system.
Oh, for sure. Women in South Korea face so much prejudice and sexism. People have even compared it to China, where those traditional patriarchal attitudes are still really strong. And you hear these crazy stories, like how some classes are teaching women that if he hits you, don't hit back, just hold on, and don't even think about asking for a divorce.
That's just awful. It's hard to believe things like that are still being said in this day and age.
It's pretty shocking, right? So it's not surprising that more and more women in South Korea are choosing not to get married or have kids. The gender pay gap is huge there, too, way bigger than in a lot of other developed countries. And the sad thing is, this idea that a woman's main role is to have children, it's still around. You even hear some politicians blaming women for taking jobs away from men.
It sounds like a really tough environment for women, and the fear of violence and abuse within relationships, that must be a big concern.
Absolutely. South Korea actually has a really high rate of female victims of violent crime compared to other developed countries. It's scary to think about all that pressure, all that discrimination, and then the fear of violence on top of it. It creates this situation where many women just don't feel safe.
It's heartbreaking to hear about. And then there's the whole issue of the aging population and the really low birth rate.
That's another big challenge for South Korea. They've got one of the fastest aging populations in the world and the lowest birth rate. It's creating this huge demographic imbalance. The government has been trying to fix it, offering all sorts of financial incentives like housing subsidies and benefits for families with kids, but so far it hasn't really worked. A lot of people just aren't having kids, partly because of all the pressures we've been talking about.
And that must have a big impact on the economy and society as a whole, especially when you consider the issue of elderly poverty.
You're right. It's a serious problem. A lot of older people in South Korea live below the poverty line. Their pensions are often tiny, and family support systems aren't what they used to be. So a lot of elderly people, especially women, end up in these really desperate situations. There have even been reports of older women in Seoul's Jeonmyo Park doing whatever they can to survive. It's really sad, and unfortunately, the economic hardship contributes to a very high suicide rate among the elderly.
It's such a contrast to the image of South Korea as this modern, wealthy country. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about the chaebols, those massive family-owned conglomerates. It seems like they have a ton of power and influence in South Korea.
They do. Chaebols like Samsung, Hyundai, SK Group, LG, they've been central to South Korea's economic success, especially after the Korean War. The government really supported them, especially during the early years under President Syngman Rhee. But with that power comes a whole set of problems.
I've heard about this unofficial 3-to-5 rule that supposedly protects chaebol executives. What's that all about?
It's a bit of a mystery, but it comes up a lot. Basically, it refers to this idea that if a chaebol executive gets convicted of a financial crime, they'll usually get a 3-year suspended sentence. And then if they behave themselves for 5 years, the whole thing gets wiped clean no matter how bad the original crime was. It's not an official law or anything, but people talk about it a lot, which suggests that there's a perception that the justice system is lenient on these powerful figures. It makes you wonder if everyone is really treated equally under the law.
It definitely raises some questions about fairness and whether money can buy you special treatment. And when you think about how much of South Korea's GDP is controlled by just the top 10 chaebols, it's pretty concerning.
It is. Those top 10 companies generate almost 60% of South Korea's GDP. That's a massive amount of economic concentration, even compared to other developed countries. And they manage to hold on to that power through these complicated ownership structures, like cross-shareholding, which lets the founding families control these huge empires, even if they don't own that much stock directly.
So it's like a system that reinforces their power and makes it hard for anyone else to break in. And I imagine there's a lot of pressure on young people to get jobs at these tables.
You're right. It's seen as the ultimate goal, the sign that you've made it. Getting a job at a chaebol is super competitive, and there's a real stigma attached to working for smaller or less prestigious companies. It's something that shapes the whole education system and the aspirations of a lot of young people.
We've also heard about some pretty nasty scandals involving tables, like the Korean Air nut rage incident. What do you think these incidents say about the culture within these powerful families?
Those incidents are definitely troubling. When you see things like the Korean Air nut rage and the water rage, where family members of chaebol owners are acting out and abusing their power, it makes you question their sense of entitlement and accountability. And then there are more systemic issues, like the health problems faced by workers in Samsung factories and the long delays in getting them proper compensation for their illnesses. These scandals really highlight the immense power that these conglomerates have and the potential for abuse when that power goes unchecked.
It's a complicated situation. On one hand, these companies have driven South Korea's economic growth, but on the other hand, they seem to be at the heart of a lot of social and ethical problems.
Okay, let's talk about something really disturbing. The Brothers Welfare Center. This is a really dark chapter in South Korea's history.
It's a horrific story, and most people outside of South Korea have never even heard of it. It's been described as a concentration camp, even a real-life version of Squid Games, because of the level of cruelty and exploitation that went on there. What exactly happened there? The accounts from survivors are just terrifying.
The stories are truly heartbreaking. You have people like Chung, who was taken there when he was only 12 years old, and Miss Lee, who was taken when she was just 7. They were kidnapped, basically, and forced to live in these overcrowded, prison-like buildings with rows and rows of bunk beds. They had their heads shaved, they were made to wear uniforms, and they were called by numbers instead of names, like they were trying to erase their identities. And then there was the forced labor. They were made to work in factories, making things like fishing rods for incredibly long hours. They were beaten if they didn't meet their quotas or if they disobeyed even the smallest rules. Basic hygiene was non-existent. Hundreds of people sharing a handful of toothbrushes. They were only given one set of clothes for the entire year, no matter the weather, and the food was barely enough to survive on.
It's just unimaginable the level of dehumanization and suffering they endured. And to make matters worse, there were reports of sexual abuse and violence as well, weren't there?
Yes. Sadly. Survivors have talked about being beaten, tortured, and raped. There were even forced abortions performed on women. And the worst part is, it wasn't just homeless people or those who genuinely needed help who ended up there. They were snatching people off the streets, anyone they considered unfit for society. There's this story of Mr. Choi, who was taken when he was just 14, and the guards would beat people in front of everyone else just to keep them terrified and in line. There was even this area they called the zombie zone, where they kept disabled people heavily drugged like they were just trying to make them disappear.
A zombie zone. That's just horrific. And then there's Chung's story about finding his own father inside the camp. It's just devastating.
It really is. Chung's father was frantic when his son disappeared. He searched everywhere for him. He went to the police. He did everything he could. And because he was so vocal and desperate, they decided he was a troublemaker and took him to the same camp where Chung was being held. When Chung finally found his father, he was heartbroken. His father had aged so much in such a short time, it was clear how much he had suffered.
It's just pure cruelty on a systemic level. And it sounds like the authorities know what was happening, maybe even supported it.
There's definitely evidence of that. The center was portrayed as this great charity, even a godly place. They forced people to participate in religious activities like it was some kind of brainwashing. And the owner, Mr. Park, he had connections to high-ranking government officials, even the president. People believe that the government was trying to clean up the streets before the 1988 Seoul Olympics, so they were more willing to look the other way while all this was happening.
So this horrific abuse was happening, and the government was either complicit or just chose to ignore it because they wanted to present this perfect image to the world. It's sickening.
It's truly awful. And even when everything came out, the punishments were incredibly light. Mr. Park, the owner, only got a short prison sentence for embezzlement and illegal confinement. Most of the more serious charges, like assault, rape, and murder, were either never investigated or were dropped. And what's even worse, similar programs, though maybe not as big, continued to operate under different names even after the Brothers Welfare Center was shut down in 1987.
And what are the survivors? What happened to them after the center closed? I can't imagine the trauma they endured just disappeared overnight.
You're right. The trauma didn't just go away. These people were stigmatized. They were scared to speak out. They were afraid of what might happen if they told their stories. It took decades for some of them to come forward. And even after a new investigation was opened in 2020, there's still a lack of justice. They haven't received adequate compensation, they haven't gotten real apologies, and they haven't received the support they need from the government. Many of them were just kids when they were taken. They lost contact with their families, and they've been struggling ever since. It's like they've been forgotten, abandoned by the very system that failed to protect them in the first place.
It's a truly horrific and shameful part of South Korea's history, and it's important that we remember these stories and fight for justice for the survivors. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about something a little different but still very interesting: the huge popularity of true crime in South Korea. It seems like everyone there is obsessed with it.
It's true. True crime is massive in South Korea. They've got tons of TV shows, podcasts, even these big communities of amateur detectives who try to solve cases. It's really fascinating.
Why do you think it's so popular? South Korea has a pretty good track record when it comes to solving crime, so it's not like they're living in fear or anything.
That's an interesting question. It could be that because they generally feel safe, they're more able to enjoy true crime as a form of entertainment. But it could also be something deeper, like a real desire for justice and accountability. In South Korea, there have been cases where the legal system hasn't delivered the answers or the closure that people wanted, so maybe this is a way for them to try and find those answers themselves. And some of these true crime shows, like Want to Know That, they actively encourage viewers to get involved, to send in tips and information. And they've actually had a real impact on some cases, like the Busan Roundhouse Kick case, where they helped uncover new evidence.
So it's not just passively watching, it's like this active participation in the pursuit of truth and justice. It's like a national hobby.
Yeah, exactly. These amateur detectives take it really seriously. They organize events, they reenact crime scenes, they go all out. And sometimes they actually find things that the police missed, or they point out inconsistencies in the official investigations. It shows just how much they care about getting to the bottom of things.
It's a really unique phenomenon. Okay, let's briefly touch on a couple more things. What about environmental issues? Seoul might be a modern city, but it still faces challenges, right?
Definitely. Air pollution is a big problem in Seoul, especially at certain times of the year. You see people wearing masks all the time to protect themselves. And then there's the yellow dust that blows in from China and Mongolia, which is full of harmful particles. It's a reminder that even developed countries struggle with environmental issues. And another interesting thing about Seoul is that you don't see many public trash cans. People are expected to sort their trash and recycle, and they usually have to take it to designated areas themselves.
It's like they've created this system that really relies on individual responsibility when it comes to waste management.
Exactly. It's very different from what you might see in other countries. And finally, we should talk about workplace culture in South Korea, which is known for being very hierarchical and demanding.
Yeah, I've heard about that. It's pretty intense, right?
It can be. They have this concept called kondae, which refers to this really strong respect for seniority and age. It dictates how people communicate and make decisions in the workplace. Junior employees are expected to agree with their seniors even if they have different ideas. After-work social events are basically mandatory. It's like an unspoken rule. And there's this constant pressure to be loyal, to work long hours, and to never question your superiors. It can stifle creativity and make it hard to speak up if you see problems.
It sounds like it could create a lot of stress and burnout.
It definitely can. The government has tried to limit working hours and improve labor rights, but there's still a lot of work to do. The demands of the workplace often come at the expense of the employee's well-being.
It seems like a balancing act that South Korea is still trying to figure out. Okay, well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive into South Korea. We've covered a lot of ground, from political turmoil and social inequality to human rights abuses, the power of the cables, and the pressures of workplace culture. It's clear that there's so much more to South Korea than the glossy image we often see.
Absolutely. And I think the biggest takeaway is that progress doesn't always benefit everyone equally. South Korea has achieved incredible economic success and has become a global cultural force, but there are still so many people who are struggling. It makes you wonder, how do you balance economic growth with ensuring that all citizens have a good quality of life and are treated fairly? It's a question that all societies need to grapple with.
It's a question that all of us should be thinking about. And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep learning about these issues and to form your own opinions. There's so much information out there, and we hope this discussion has inspired you to dig deeper. Thanks for joining us as we explored this complex and often hidden side of South Korea.